Hey review family, keep it high, keep it tight. My name is Jay Morris, the review guy, reviewing music for the love of music, and I'm back again to bring you another video. And in this one, I'm going to be covering the new Osiah record entitled Loss. Osiah is a UK band that I have been aware of since their last full-length studio record. It was something that was a little bit fun at the time, but in my opinion did not leave any sort of lasting impact. Still though, I stepped into this record just optimistic and excited to check it out. For the most part, this year has been a little bit bone dry with really standout, really amazing deathcore records. Of course you have bands like Bone Carver and Brand of Sacrifice and To the Grave, but other than that, it hasn't really been a massive mountain of bands that have been doing something great. So I was hoping that Osiah would change that up a little bit, break the mold a little bit. And I think one thing that is apparent straight away from this record in comparison to other ones is their intensity has just reached its peak, to say the least. You see, if you're unfamiliar with this band, Osiah can be described as technical deathcore, so if the raw and sort of cookie cutter style isn't really your thing, try this. Trust me, you might end up liking it a lot more than just your typical raw, brutal deathcore type of record. Certainly there are a lot of themes across this record that fall in line with what you get in the stereotypical and when you get in the orthodox. I just think that they sort of cover up their flaws a little bit better in the way of technicality. They bring in a lot of different types of riff structures and patterns to their riff playing to make it sort of sound a little bit more fleshed out, a little bit more beefy and buffed up, especially just on the guitar work. Percussion work really does have that octopus flair to it, and the vocals can range from just normal deathcore vocals to some really brutal stylings. So to equate them as just a technical deathcore band without any of the influences from the scene as a whole, I think is a little bit asinine. But their approach to deathcore isn't necessarily as technical and over the top as, say, Rings of Saturn or an Infant Annihilator. Their BPM isn't just in unimaginable lanes. Their velocity can be a little bit slower in comparison with bands like that. They do it smart. The texture of this thing though, how do you even describe this? Holy shit. Battering ram. Battering ram of sound. Walls of noise. Frantic and panicky, this record puts you on edge and really keeps you there. It feels anxious and tense the entire way through pretty much. And of course, this wouldn't be a deathcore record if you didn't have the plethora of breakdowns. These are sort of a grab bag. They can be very well made or they can be extremely unworthy of inclusion on a track. Within the very first minute of the track, The Second Law, you are immediately met with this knuckle chuck breakdown that, even though it really is on the nose, you can't help but make a sour face at it. And I think that's how a lot of these breakdowns play out. They're extremely predictable. You feel them coming, you feel the build-up, and they don't really make any qualms about just catapulting you into just an over-the-top deathcore breakdown. Now, depending on what you've come to expect, that could be something that you meet with a lot of enthusiasm or just scratch your head and roll your eyes at. With so many deathcore bands nowadays in the current scene just sort of hitting you with a lot of high BPM tracks and thinking that quickness equals good songwriting, it is a little bit refreshing to hear occasionally some bands come around that make it a little bit more technical, and that's something that Osiah for the most part really does excel at. You can't really overcompensate good songwriting solely for speed. Floundering potential happens just as often with these deathcore records, whether they're technical or not, with just an innumerable amount of breakdowns and so much double bass and brutality that just are so underwhelming and will not stick with you whatsoever. And I think Osiah finds himself sort of in the middle ground of that, where there is enough here to keep you interested, but considering how long this record is in the grand scheme of a deathcore record, I think that at times they really do fall into some really rudimentary soundscapes, which is funny and seems a little bit like a contradiction considering the breakdowns are some of the best parts of this record despite being some of the more simpler parts of this record. Progressively, they fall somewhere in between musically varied and extremely familiar. It's noisy, it's abrasive, it's constantly moving. This record really doesn't allow itself any downtime, which can be kind of destructive at times. But I think that compatibility-wise, the layering is one thing that continued to catch my ear. Very Suicide Silence-esque. I want to point out Temporal Punishment and Queen of Sorrow as 2 tracks to keep an eye out for. If you want taste testers, these 2 tracks, in my opinion, showcase what the record does the best in the easiest way. If you like these 2 tracks, you're gonna like the record. If you don't, you're not. And that's a knock against it, in my opinion. Once you've heard a couple of these tracks, you probably have heard most of them. Their variation more so comes from tweaking things ever so slightly to make something new out of it, as opposed to an entirely new idea from track to track to track. There are thrash metal moments. There are moments where a breakdown will be a little bit more gent-inspired and technical and sort of borderline on that, but at other times they will really just ride the own wave that they have created. And for a deathcore record that was 13 tracks long, and for a deathcore record that is 13 tracks long and almost 50 minutes worth of material, I can't lie, I was expecting a little bit more and just holding out for a little bit more. It's a bit of a delusion factor. On first listen, it sounds wonderful, it's exciting, it's thrilling, but on repeated listens, you really start to understand where this record falls short. And point blank, that's just memorability. It becomes a lot more desaturated when you start to pick it apart, and becomes more so a lesson of just how to make a pretty serviceable panicky deathcore record. It perks you up though, I can say that. The lows sound a lot like Impending Doom, the highs sound a lot like Mitch Lucker of Suicide Silence, the low timbre does read a lot sort of like Thy Art Is Murder if you want an indication, and surprisingly, I have talked a lot about breakdowns because they're a focal point of this record. Breakdown construction can be pretty damn varied, I gotta give them that. The opening up of each one, don't get me wrong, is extremely predictable but still very intelligently put. I wouldn't call it gent, more so just borderline gent, sort of a mechanized horror show of sorts. It seems like to me Osiah struggles to figure out what direction they genuinely want to go in with a track. On almost every single track, in the span of a single track, and this is pretty consistent across the entire record, they will stay stationary, they'll change, they'll progress, they'll digress, they'll stay in one spot for too long, they'll move too quickly, and it just seems directionless and like they don't exactly know where they want to take a track. And this is coming from someone that loves progressive music and technical music. Progressive metalcore is one of my favorite, if not my favorite metal genres or subgenres, but it just seems like they don't really know where they want to take a track once they really get into the thick of it, and it can swap up so much that the 180s are jarring to say the least. But the beginning of the second law with like the cattle decapitation-esque shrieks, or the breakdown on specifically the track War Within Our Walls, exhibit a lot of great strength and songwriting. One thing I can acknowledge is these guys know what the hell they're doing. But in the future, I'd love to see Osiah sort of take their sound in more of a direction that feels like they understand how to utilize their technicality in a smarter way. They definitely have a lot of smartness and wit about their songwriting, and when it comes to riff direction and writing breakdowns, they clearly have a good head on their shoulders. But I think as a whole, this is a blurry record that sort of blurs in the haze a little bit too much, gets lost in the fog, and just lacks any sort of genuine direction, and combine that with a lack of sheer memorability on a lot of these tracks, and it becomes a very heavy riff fest with a lot of breakdowns that can sound good when it's on, but as a whole just not leave that much of a lasting impact. For this record, I'm going to be giving it a 5.5 out of 10. And that is a wrap. Have you heard this new Osiah record, Lost? If you have, let me know in the comment section below what you thought about it. I would love to discuss this record with you. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, the Review Guy, and I'm signing off saying, fair.